Alright guys, welcome to my favorite things. Today I wanted to talk about my RDL. I've been getting a lot of questions on Instagram in regards to my RDL, why I'm doing it so often, is it the best exercise for hamstrings, etc, etc, etc. So I just figured I'll just go ahead and answer these questions in long form and do a YouTube video. So here we are. So basically, just to give my context as to why it's my favorite movement at the moment. We got to talk a little bit about what I was doing prior to it. So my hybrid stance sumo deadlift was my bread and butter for a very, very long time, like from 2010 all the way up until probably the last 3 or 4 months. That was my bread and butter movement. I was hitting that movement like once per week. And it brought me a lot of success as far as improving my development with my lower half, especially my glutes and hamstrings. So that was a bread and butter movement, and because of the progress that I made with it, it was like reassuring to me that okay, this movement is very fruitful for me. So I just rolled with it, and because of the progress, because I was able to perform pretty well with it, I just enjoyed it, and I just kind of made it a point to keep it in my programming, for the most part the entire time. Every once in a while I would use RDL as a substitute. I would phase the deadlift out for a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then bring the RDL in just to kind of give me a break from those deadlifts, and then I would quickly go back to those deadlifts. RDL, I always thought it was just an okay exercise, just because of the way it felt for me personally. Like, I enjoyed that deadlift more so than the RDL. Not to say the RDL is an inferior movement or anything like that. It was just more of an enjoyment thing, more of a comfort thing. Like the deadlift just was kind of more gravitating for me. So that's kind of the context behind why I was such a fan of my deadlift. Like, it just was very fruitful, like I mentioned. But the last 3 months, I had a week or two where I phased the RDL in to kind of give myself a little bit of a break. I basically said, you know what, let me try to do both of these movements in the protocol, for a while. Let's see if I can keep both of them in there. So I was doing deadlifts once per week, and I was doing RDL once per week on separate days, of course, because they're both pretty taxing. So to do those 2 lifts on one session, it's pretty damn taxing, and it's a little redundant because they're both hip hinge movements for the most part. So I was experimenting with that, and not to say that it was going bad, but what I noticed was that my RDL started to move really well. Like, my ability to increase the loads, my ability to do more sets, things like that. Like, I noticed that the RDL, from a progress standpoint, was starting to move a lot faster than my deadlift, and I wasn't feeling as beat up from them as I was my deadlift. So it was kind of like a light bulb movement. Like, wait a second here. If the RDL is moving this well for me, if it's not taxing me as much, I'm recovering better from it, then it might make sense to maybe do this movement altogether, and then maybe throw out those deadlifts. And so that's basically what I did. I'm like, okay, let me try this out. Let me see what I get from it. And of course, moving those deadlifts out of the program kind of permanently, at least for the time being. There's a little bit of insecurity there, like, I wonder if I'm still going to make the same type of progress. Am I going to see any type of regression? But I also know that the RDL, for the most part, is hitting the same musculature as my deadlifts were, with the exception of my quads. There's a little more quad involvement on my deadlifts, so I just kind of figured, okay, if I take the deadlift out, I can just do maybe 1 or 2 more sets of leg press to make up that volume difference. So that kind of cured a little bit of insecurity there. So that's what I did, and I've been running with it. And because of the progress that I'm seeing with the RDLs, and because of how smooth it's feeling, how on lock I am with my form, like, I've just gravitated towards it, and I kind of haven't looked back. So that's kind of the context behind why I've kind of been doing RDLs more frequently, why they're in my programming right now. It's more because one, they're effective, like they are, like I said, hitting my hamstrings, my glutes, my lower back. I'm progressing extremely well on them, and that's always motivating. Anytime you're doing an exercise and it's moving extremely well, you're going to be super motivated. You're going to want to keep improving and keep, getting after it. And, I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying the movement. So that's why, right now it's one of my favorite movements, and it's a keeper for the time being. Now, as far as, you know, what my frequency is, like I said, right now I'm hitting, that RDL like twice every 7 to 9 days, maybe 7 to 10 days, kind of depending on some things. But that's kind of the frequency. And I have a heavier session and a lighter session. So the heavy session, the rep range is 5 to 6 reps. Anything more than 6 reps, then it's kind of tends to feel a little bit on the lighter side. Anything below 5, and I just feel unsafe. Like I don't feel like I can maintain my form. Like the load just gets too heavy, and there's just too much risk. And the last thing I want to do is to break my form and then have a low back strain or anything like that. So 5 to 6 rep range as far as being heavy for me, like that's a nice sweet spot that I can lift heavy while maintaining very good form and staying relatively safe. Now, the lighter session, sweet spot for me is 8 to 10 reps. Anything above 10 feels like cardio. And once it starts to feel like cardio for me, then, because of like that stamina, endurance, like, okay, after 10 reps, I'm like getting gassed. Like I'm more prone to form breakdown. So like I said, 10 is kind of like the max number of reps I do. And then 8 is kind of like that bottom number, and that's kind of like my sweet spot for the lighter sessions. As far as the number of sets, 3 to 4 is kind of where I gravitate towards. Anything more than 4, and it's just like it just wipes me out, and I'm gassed. Like 2, 3, 4 days later, I'm still experiencing a lot of DOMs in my hamstrings. So for me personally, 3 to 4 is a sweet spot, and I typically do gravitate more towards 3 sets on most of these sessions. After 3 sets of same thing with my deadlift. Like anything more than 3 sets, and what I noticed was it's just overly demanding, hard to recover from. So 3 sets is generally kind of where my sweet spot is for the number of sets. As far as progressing on the RDL, so for me personally, when I go heavy, at first I was able to get after it and increase loads pretty frequently, 5, 10, maybe 15, 20 pound jumps. But after, initial few weeks, it started to slow down a bit. So now what I do is, right now my heaviest load that I've been working with lately has been 405. And I worked myself up. I started out at 5 reps, but I would only get like maybe 1 or 2 sets, 5 reps, leaving, at the minimum 1 rep in reserve. I want to make sure I'm leaving at least 1 rep in reserve on this movement, so I don't want to go to failure because I don't want to risk injury. So it's typically my reps in reserve are going to be anywhere between 1 to 3. And I like to gravitate more towards 2 or 3 if I can, unless I'm kind of getting after it. But yeah, for the most part, it would be like, okay, 405, hitting 5 reps, and eventually getting 3 sets across the board with 5 reps. And once the reps in reserve, kind of inch higher, where they're like, okay, it's 2 to 3 in the tank, then I feel comfortable enough to say, okay, now I can shoot for 6 reps. And then again, the goal will be to, okay, let me get 4 or 5 for 6 reps, like 3 sets of 6 reps. And then if the reps in reserve, again, are like 2 to 3, then I know, okay, I can probably go ahead and increase the load. If not, then I'm going to keep working with, 405 and making that 3x6 more efficient. Like, okay, once it starts hitting 2 to 3 reps in reserve, then, okay, now I can go ahead and maybe bump load up again and then go towards the lower end of the rep range. So that's kind of how I've worked those progressions, both on the heavy sessions and the light, kind of the same concept. So that's my progression. Now, as far as executing the lift, like for me personally, what feels the smoothest, the most comfortable, and feels like efficient and effective for me is more like a shoulder width stance, and I like to point my toes slightly out. That just allows me to be a little bit more mobile with my hips. So I like my toes pointed out just a little bit. Hand spacing a little bit wider than my outside of my legs, I should say. And I definitely use either wrist straps or I use Versa grips to maintain grip. Obviously, trying to hold 405 isn't going to go over too well. So with the straps, with the grips, just secures that grip. I don't have to, lose focus on anything because of my grip. So it just works out really well with that. And then as far as the actual movement, so personally, my cues for me are break at the hips first, so allow those hips to travel backwards initially. That's the first thing I want to do. As the bar is traveling down, I want to keep it close to my legs. I don't want the bar to get away from me and go away from my legs, because once that happens, then a lot of your weight will shift on your toes, and when that happens, then it puts a lot of burden on your lower back. So I really try to keep my hips back, let the bar stay, slide down, stay close to my legs. And then I'll even cue myself to lift my toes up off the ground slightly. That way I ensure I stay on my heels and midfoot more so than my toes. So again, just to prevent my lower back from taking the brunt of the work. So I want to keep all that tension, all that weight distribution on my heels and midfoot, so therefore the weight is transferring into my hamstrings, my glutes, and less on my lower back. Again, the last thing I want to do is be on my toes the entire time, because again, my torso is going to really lean over forward, and then your lower back is just going to be like, what the heck is going on here? So that's kind of my cues. And then on the way up, I should mention too, I really try to focus on driving my heels through the floor, like really just pushing in with my heels and driving up with the heels, because then I ensure that my hips, or not my hips, my glutes and my hamstrings are doing the majority of the work. Of course, your lower back is going to assist in the movement, but that's key. You want it to assist. You don't want it to be the prime mover. So that, again, that's important that I don't shift on my toes. And then as I'm coming up and I'm going towards lockout, my thing is just squeezing the glutes, hips forward. Like once I'm engaged, like my glutes are fully engaged, my hips forward. For me, that's where the lift is complete. I don't purposely try to hyperextend my back because, again, I don't really want to put any more burden or any more stress on my lower back. It's getting enough work just insisting in the movement, and I don't need it to try to finish at the very, very top of the movement. I'll just kind of stop when my glutes are kind of locked in. I'll leave it there. And that's how I kind of help to, keep my lower back as safe as I can possibly keep it. So that's kind of my cues for the way I execute the movement. And again, this is my my context, and this is what I prefer to do for myself. And the reason I do all these things is, again, for the most part, I'm thinking about practicality, I'm thinking about my safety, I'm thinking about sustainability. That's kind of my context with RDL. Hopefully you guys get something out of this, and maybe in the future I'll do another one of these.
Is that 405 for 20 or something? Ooh. Is that 405? Yeah.